It was a quiet evening in the small suburban house. The kind of evening that felt like time was standing still, where the only sounds were the soft ticking of the clock on the wall and the occasional creak of the house settling in the cool night air. Inside, the warmth from the kitchen filled the living room, where Sarah sat on the couch with a book in hand. Her rabbit, Oliver, was curled up on the rug by the fireplace, lazily flicking his ears as the fire crackled. Sarah loved her rabbit. He wasn't just a pet to her, he was a friend, a companion who had been there with her through thick and thin. She had adopted him as a baby, a tiny, fluff ball of a thing with eyes that always seemed to be filled with curiosity. Over the years, Sarah had learned to read Oliver's moods, the way he twitched his nose when something was wrong, the way he hopped excitedly when he was happy, and the way his ears would flick back when he was annoyed. She knew him well, but tonight, something felt different. As she flipped through the pages of her book, she noticed Oliver moving restlessly on the rug. At first, she thought it was just his usual routine, maybe he was stretching, maybe he was just bored. But then he started hopping around in erratic circles, thumping his little hind feet against the floor. It was unusual for him. Oliver was normally a calm rabbit, content to relax for hours at a time. She watched him, curious but not immediately alarmed. The more she watched, though, the more worried she became. Oliver wasn't just being playful. He was agitated, pacing back and forth, flicking his ears wildly, and looking around the room as though he were trying to find something. His little nose twitched as he sniffed the air, and then, with a startled thump of his back legs, he bolted toward the door. Sarah put her book down, feeling a pang of concern. She had never seen Oliver act like this before. It was as if he was trying to tell her something. She stood up from the couch and walked over to him. "What's the matter, boy?" she murmured, kneeling down beside him. Oliver looked up at her, his eyes wide and frantic. He thumped again, and this time Sarah saw that he wasn't just being restless, he was trying to get her attention, trying to warn her about something. She looked around the room, but everything seemed normal. The air felt fine, the temperature comfortable. Nothing seemed out of place. But Oliver wasn't calming down. If anything, his behavior grew more intense. He bolted across the room, nudging the door with his nose, trying to get out into the kitchen. He was frantic now, thumping rapidly, his tiny heart racing. Okay, calm down," Sarah said, following him to the door. She opened it and stepped into the kitchen, but there was no obvious reason for Oliver's panic. The kitchen was quiet, the only sounds were the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock. Oliver hopped over to the stove, then to the sink, his little nose twitching furiously. It was almost as if he was trying to lead her somewhere, though she couldn't figure out where. That's when she smelled it, a faint, almost imperceptible odor in the air. A smell that was so subtle, so faint, that it could easily be dismissed. It was something unfamiliar, something sharp. At first, Sarah couldn't place it. But as she breathed deeper, the realization hit her. It was the unmistakable scent of gas. Her heart skipped a beat. She had heard the warnings before. Gas leaks were a dangerous and silent threat, often unnoticed until it was too late. And now, her rabbit, Oliver, was acting like a warning alarm, leading her to the very source of danger. "Oliver, what are you trying to tell me?" she whispered, realizing the gravity of the situation. But Oliver didn't answer. He was still hopping around frantically, moving from one side of the room to the other, his nose pressed to the floor, searching for the source of the gas. It wasn't long before Sarah realized that the leak wasn't coming from the stove or any of the appliances she usually worried about. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere she hadn't thought to check. The kitchen was silent, but Oliver's urgent movements told her that the danger was real. She grabbed her phone, dialing the gas company's emergency number. Her hands were shaking. The voice on the other end was calm, reassuring, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. "Please, come quickly," she said. "I think there's a gas leak in my house." And then, without thinking, she turned back to Oliver. He was standing by the kitchen door now, still restless, still trying to warn her. His small, furry body seemed to vibrate with energy, as though he knew something was wrong and needed to get her to act. But the worst part was yet to come. As Sarah took a deep breath and turned to head outside to wait for help, she glanced back at Oliver. He had stopped moving. His ears were drooping, his eyes half closed, and he was standing stock still, as though exhausted. His body seemed limp, his breathing shallow. "Oliver?" she called, her voice shaking with concern. But the rabbit didn't respond. And that was when she realized something was terribly wrong. Panic surged through Sarah's veins as she rushed over to Oliver's side. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing louder in her ears. The faint smell of gas still lingered in the air, thickening her senses, making it harder to focus. She knelt down beside the small rabbit, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch him. "Oliver, wake up," she whispered desperately, nudging him gently. But he didn't stir. His little body felt too warm, and his fur was matted with a dampness that Sarah couldn't explain. He wasn't the playful, energetic rabbit she knew, he was lifeless, still, and too quiet. She had never seen him like this. Oliver had always been so full of life, so vibrant, hopping and playing at everver opportunity. But now, he lay there motionless, his eyes barely open. The realization hit her with the force of a wrecking ball. The gas was affecting him. It was poisoning him. "Oliver, no." Her voice broke as she stroked his fur, her mind racing. Could she get him help? Was it too late? Her fingers hovered over her phone again, but a terrible sense of dread filled her. She didn't know if even the gas company would arrive in time. She didn't know if Oliver had time. Her thoughts swirled in panic, but there was no time to waste. She quickly moved toward the window and opened it wide, hoping to clear the air, hoping the fresh oxygen would help her rabbit, help her. But the gas hadn't just affected Oliver, it was everywhere. The more Sarah thought about it, the more she understood that the leak must have been slowly filling the house with fumes, undetected, until it reached a dangerous level. She had noticed nothing out of the ordinary before Oliver's frantic behavior, but now it was clear that the gas was seeping in all around them, a silent intruder. She returned to Oliver, cradling him gently in her arms, her mind whirling with helplessness. She could feel his breath growing even more shallow, and every minute that passed made her fear the worst. She had to get him out of the house. She couldn't lose him, not like this, not because of something she couldn't even see, something invisible. She looked down at him and felt tears pricking her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Oliver. I should have noticed sooner." In a rush of instinct, she grabbed her jacket and carefully placed Oliver inside the pocket, hoping to keep him warm. She wasn't sure it would help, but it was the only thing she could think to do. She stumbled toward the front door, throwing it open and stepping outside, gasping for the cool night air as though she could inhale enough to rid her body of the fumes that had already taken their toll. As she stepped out onto the front porch, she tried to steady her breathing, but her thoughts remained chaotic. The gas was still in the house. Her house. It was dangerous for her, for anyone who came in, and the emergency team still hadn't arrived. "Please, hurry," she muttered under her breath, pacing back and forth, trying to keep her eyes on the road, watching for the arrival of the emergency team. She could still feel the panic rising in her chest, the fear of losing Oliver. But then, her mind reeled back to him, back to the tiny rabbit that had been her constant companion for so long. She needed to do something more. She pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed a second number, her neighbor, Carla. She needed someone else to help, someone to stay with Oliver, someone to try and bring him back. The phone rang twice before Carla picked up. "Hello?" Carla's voice was groggy, like she had just woken up. "It's me, Sarah," she said breathlessly. "There's a gas leak in my house. Please, I need you to come over now. I don't know how much time we have, but Oliver, he's not breathing right. I think the gas is poisoning him." There was a pause on the other end. "Oh my God," Carla said, her voice suddenly awake and filled with concern. "I'm coming right over. Hang tight, Sarah. Stay safe." Sarah hung up, glancing down at the little rabbit still nestled in her pocket. His tiny body was so still, so fragile in the face of something so much larger than him. And though the air outside was cleaner, fresher, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was too late. That the poison had already done its damage. Oliver's breathing had become even more shallow, a weak flutter that barely seemed like breathing at all. Sarah's mind screamed at her, but there was nothing she could do. Even as she prayed for the emergency team to arrive, even as Carla rushed over, Sarah felt the terrible weight of inevitability settle over her heart. She stood there on the porch, watching the darkness of the night, listening for the sound of approaching sirens, but all she could hear was the rapid, panicked thumping of her own heart. And then, just as she felt a tear slide down her cheek, she heard a faint, weak sound from inside her pocket. Oliver's nose twitched. It wasn't much, but it was something. A tiny, fragile sign of life. Sarah gasped, her heart lifting for a moment. She pressed her hand to her pocket, her eyes wide with a sliver of hope. "Come on, Oliver," she whispered, holding him closer. "You can make it through this. You have to." The moment she said it, she heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. The sirens. Help was coming. But would it be too late? The wail of sirens grew louder as Sarah stood on her front porch, clutching Oliver gently in her arms. She held her breath, praying for a miracle, praying that somehow, the tiny rabbit she loved so dearly would pull through. The feeling of helplessness weighed on her like a heavy blanket, pressing down on her chest, but she refused to let go of hope. The headlights of the emergency vehicle cut through the night, illuminating the driveway and casting long shadows across the yard. The door to the ambulance swung open, and two paramedics rushed out, their faces serious, their expressions focused. Sarah didn't wait for them to approach. She rushed toward them, holding Oliver out in front of her. "He's been exposed to the gas," she explained breathlessly. "He was acting so strange, and then he just stopped breathing." One of the paramedics, a woman with short brown hair and steady hands, knelt down to examine Oliver. She checked his pulse, his breathing, and then looked up at Sarah with a somber expression. "We need to get him to the hospital right away," the paramedic said, her voice calm but urgent. "He's been exposed to carbon monoxide, likely for a prolonged period. We need to stabilize him." Sarah felt a surge of relief, but it was tempered by the fear that gnawed at her insides. She nodded quickly, her hands trembling as she carefully placed Oliver into the paramedic's arms. The rabbit's tiny body was limp, his eyes barely open, his breathing faint. Sarah could feel his warmth, but it wasn't the same. It was a warmth that felt too fragile, too fleeting. They hurried to the ambulance, and Sarah climbed in alongside them. The doors slammed shut behind her, and the paramedics immediately began working to stabilize Oliver. They attached him to an oxygen mask, pumped his tiny chest with careful hands, and monitored his vitals. Sarah sat by his side, her heart racing. She couldn't tear her eyes away from him. It felt as though time had slowed to a crawl. Every beat of her heart seemed to stretch out, a painful reminder of how much she loved this little creature, how much he meant to her. Her mind was a storm of emotions, fear, hope, desperation. She was clinging to every moment, every breath, praying for him to pull through. "Is he going to be okay?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't know if she could bear to hear the answer, but she needed to know. The paramedic, a man with dark eyes and a serious expression, didn't answer immediately. He just kept working, checking the equipment, adjusting the oxygen. He seemed to be doing everything he could, but Sarah could feel the weight of his silence. The ambulance sped through the night, its sirens blaring as it cut through the streets. Sarah felt every bump in the road, each one jarring her from the deep, painful thoughts that gripped her. She couldn't stop thinking about the way Oliver had tried to warn her, how he had done everything he could to save her, to save them both. He had been her protector, her companion, her friend. He had saved her life by guiding her to the gas leak, but now, he was the one in danger. And no matter how hard she tried to hope, she couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. Minutes felt like hours. The hospital came into view, a beacon of light in the distance. The ambulance screeched to a halt outside the emergency entrance, and the paramedics rushed Oliver out on a stretcher. Sarah followed closely behind, her legs shaky beneath her, her heart pounding in her throat. In the emergency room, the doctors took over. They worked quickly, their movements swift and professional, but there was a grimness in their eyes that told Sarah everything she needed to know. She stood by helplessly, watching as they hooked Oliver up to machines, their voices muted by the pounding in her ears. They spoke in technical terms she didn't fully understand, but there was no mistaking the urgency in their actions. One of the doctors approached Sarah after a few minutes, his face weary but kind. "We're doing everything we can, but it's going to be touch and go for a while. He's suffered significant exposure. We need to see how he responds to treatment." Sarah nodded, her throat tight with fear. Please, just, please help him. He's my friend. He's everything to me." The doctor gave her a sad smile, his eyes softening with sympathy. "I'll let you know as soon as we have any news. Just try to stay calm." She sat in the sterile waiting room, her hands clasped tightly together, her mind racing. The minutes stretched on, each one filled with agonizing silence. It felt like time had stopped altogether, the world outside the hospital doors completely forgotten. She couldn't focus on anything except Oliver, the way he had tried so desperately to warn her, the way he had given everything for her safety, even when he was the one in danger. After what seemed like an eternity, the doctor returned. His face was grave. "Sarah," he said quietly. "I'm afraid Oliver didn't make it." The words hit her like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her knees going weak beneath her. For a moment, she couldn't process what he was saying. It couldn't be true. It couldn't be real. Oliver had been so full of life just hours ago. She had been so sure he would pull through. But now he was gone. Tears welled up in her eyes as the weight of the loss crashed down on her. The world seemed to blur around her, everything fading into the background. She had failed him. He had saved her life, but she couldn't save his. The doctor's words were a distant hum in her ears. All she could hear was the rush of emotions swelling in her chest, the heartbreak, the overwhelming sense of loss. Oliver was gone, and there was nothing she could do to bring him back. A small, painful sob escaped her lips as she collapsed into the chair. She buried her face in her hands, grief taking over in a wave that she couldn't escape. But even as the tears fell, Sarah knew one thing: Oliver had given her the greatest gift of all. He had saved her life, and in the end, he had sacrificed his own to do so. He was her hero, and no matter how much it hurt, she would never forget him. As the sound of her sobs filled the quiet room, a faint memory of Oliver's soft, comforting thumps echoed in her mind. He was gone, but he would never be forgotten.